Okay, so today we want to talk about sensitivity and specificity of orthopedic examination tests, or really sensitivity and specificity of any examination test. So when you're thinking about sensitivity and specificity, you want to remember the rules snout and spin, right? So we have snout written and spin written. So when you're looking at snout, SNN out. So sensitivity, a sensitive test, if it is negative, you will rule out a condition, because tests that are highly sensitive are really good for screening. So you want to use a really sensitive test so it will pick up on everything possible so you don't miss anything. So sensitive tests, when they are negative, rule out a condition. The problem with sensitive tests is they lead to a lot of false positives. And a false positive is also the equivalent of a type 1 error. So because they're so sensitive, you get false positives because people test positive on a test when they don't actually have the condition. So a really good example is when you look at maybe subacromial impingement test cluster. The subacromial impingement test cluster is Hawkins-Kennedy test, the painful arc test, and the external rotation stress test, right? So if we look at these, Hawkins-Kennedy test is a very sensitive test. If you do the Hawkins-Kennedy test on most people, it will hurt most people's shoulder because it's really sensitive. So if you do the Hawkins-Kennedy test on someone's shoulder and it is negative, that means because it's a highly sensitive test, you can probably rule out shoulder pathology. Meanwhile, the painful arc test is a little bit more specific. So if you do the painful arc test and it is positive or negative, you can't necessarily rule out the condition. We'll talk about specificity over here. So if I was going to flip and talk about specificity, your spin rule. So a specific test, when positive, means you can rule in a condition, right? So a highly specific test, when positive, gives you a greater confidence that that person is actually presenting with that condition that you're testing for. So like we mentioned in subacromial impingement syndrome, a painful arc test is more specific. So if somebody tests positive on the painful arc test, because it is a more specific test, we have a higher likelihood of ruling in that condition. So if they are positive on the Hawkins-Kennedy test and positive on the painful arc test and positive on the external rotation test, then we have a strong likelihood that they have the condition that we're testing for, subacromial impingement. Now, if we look at specific tests, specific test, when positive, rule in a condition, that leads us to a lot of false negatives, or what's called type 2 errors. So because specific tests aren't very sensitive, you will get a lot of false negatives. So somebody that actually has the condition, but they test negative on the test. So if we look back over here at subacromial impingement, the painful arc test is very specific. Just because they test negatively on the painful arc test does not mean that they don't have the condition, because you get a lot of false negatives with tests that are more specific. So we can look at that again with the SI joint cluster test, or the Gainsland's test, right? I mean the Laslett test cluster from Laslett 2008. So we have the gapping or distraction tests, the compression test, the thigh thrust test, the Gainsland test, and the sacral thrust test. So independently, the thigh thrust test is your most sensitive test, meaning that if they are negative on that sensitive test, you can rule out the likelihood that it's SI joint pathology. Now, that sensitivity is really only about 82 or 85%. So there's still a 15 to 18% likelihood that you could be wrong there. So it's not a tremendously sensitive test. If we had a test that was 100% sensitive and somebody tested negative, you could automatically rule out that condition. But we don't have any tests that are 100% sensitive or 100% specific. Then we look at the gapping or distraction test, and that is actually a more specific test. So if a specific test is positive, it leads to a greater likelihood of ruling in the condition, right? And then when you combine these tests together, if you get 3 out of 5 of those positive after you've ruled out the likelihood of lumbar radiculopathy through a repeated motions exam, then we see the entire test cluster go up to a little over a 90% sensitivity and a mid-80s% specificity. So this is why combining tests together to give a total higher sensitivity and a total higher specificity leads to more confidence in your diagnoses. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, post them down below.